Excellencies and friends, I'm glad to welcome all of you to this international panel discussion presented by Tillotoma Foundation, titled, Is Indian Ocean the Next Focus of China's Bellicosity? I'm Soham Das, Director of Tillotoma Foundation. Tillotoma Foundation is engaged principally in international relations, financial, strategic, environmental, and defense policy discussions. It gives me great pleasure to be able to present an international conference that has such erudite and diverse participation. We attempt a comprehensive analysis of the subject at hand in today's session as we discuss an issue that has immense contemporary significance. I must sincerely thank Professor Bellicosity Ghoshal, Distinguished Advisor, Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian Studies, Tillotoma Foundation, for his extensive contribution to this conference. Let me now introduce the very erudite panel of experts from 6 stakeholder countries of Indian Ocean. First, we have Vice Admiral Pradeep Chatterjee, who has been the former Commander-in-Chief, Andaman and Nicobar Joint Command, and a former Deputy Chief of the Indian Navy. We have Admiral Dr. Jayant Kolambaje, who is presently the Additional Secretary for Foreign Affairs to the President of Sri Lanka. He has also been the Chief of the Sri Lankan Navy. Vice Admiral Pradeep Koshiba, former Commandant, National Defense College, and former Director General, National Maritime Foundation. He has also been the former Chief of Naval Staff, Information Warfare and Operations. We have Professor Khin Maung No, noted economist and Vice Chairman, Myanmar Economic Association. We also have Dr. Irina Lonella Pop, who is the Director and Senior Research Fellow, Asia Pacific Program, Center for Geopolitics and Security and Realism Studies in United Kingdom. We have Dr. Satu Limai, Vice President and Director, East-West Center, Washington. We have Commander Abhijit Singh. He's a former Indian Navy officer, presently Senior Fellow and Head of Maritime Policy Initiative of the Observer Research Foundation. He has also been a former Research Fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. We also have Dr. David Brewster, Senior Research Fellow of the National Security College at Australian National University. Finally, today's erudite panel will be chaired by our distinguished advisor, Professor Bellicosity Ghoshal. Professor Ghoshal was formerly a professor and chair in South and Southeast Asian Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has also been the Secretary General of Society for Indian Ocean Studies. I request Professor Bellicosity Ghoshal to begin the session, and also to all the audience that you can present your questions through the chat option and keep sending your questions throughout the panel, throughout the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think it's an immense pleasure on my part to really welcome you and agreeing to join this discussion to decode China's foreign policy behavior and military behavior as well. We are having this particularly in the light of recent China's aggressive behavior practically on all fronts. On South China Sea, it has bullied the smaller neighbors. It has invaded India in eastern sector of Ladakh. It has passed a law in Hong Kong, practically demeaning the harbor's importance as an economic center. It has intimidated Taiwan. It has deprived the smaller countries in the Mekong River area by hoarding water. So within this background, China has practically violated many international laws. I pose this question, actually. Is Indian Ocean the next focus of China's bellicosity? The reason being that in the light of, again, India's own experience in Ladakh, and despite all the meetings, various at the diplomatic level and also at the military level, the Chinese have refused to budge from their occupation and have refused to restore the status quo. in Ladakh. Now, China is not a literal state in the Indian Ocean. It has never played any important role in the historical period, except that famous, Zheng Ho expedition. Other than that, China had never any role beyond Malacca Strait. It did play an important role in the trade of the Indian Ocean, but never beyond the Malacca Straits. In fact, beyond Malacca Straits, it had always been the Arab and the Indian traders who had been the main important sort of trading powers in the Indian Ocean. That doesn't mean that China has no legitimate role in the Indian Ocean. It can easily, anybody has the right to move into the Indian Ocean according to international law, as per the international law and international norms. But that is the question, actually. In fact, China could have, if you go historically, and in fact, it could have welcomed, or China could have been a legitimate sort of player in the Indian Ocean, provided it had accepted the Indo-Pacific concept. Because within that concept, it is an inclusive, open, and rule-based order kind of thing. So China could have easily got a legitimate role in the Indian Ocean, provided China had joined the concept of Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, China has actually undermined it. In fact, beginning with its foreign minister, who called it a oceanic foam in the Pacific or in the Indian Ocean, which will dissipate very soon. That was the kind of approach that China had towards this concept of Indo-Pacific. Now, in fact, if one goes to the past, say, 20-year period regarding China's statements and also the writings of some of the scholars, one can see a particular trend in its attitude towards the Indian Ocean. In fact, for the first time in 2003, Hu Jintao, the Chinese president, had really spoken about the Malacca dilemma and also expressed his fear that any moment its maritime line could be blocked by some other powers. And from that time onwards, actually, China began to strategize on the Indian Ocean, how to get an entry and how to get a legitimate role. Or, who knows, like in the case of South China Sea, it wants to dominate the Indian Ocean as well in course of time. I think it was November 2003, as I mentioned, Hu Jintao first talked about the Malacca dilemma. Now, I think it was in 2008 that the Chinese Navy, made its first operational move, deployment in the Gulf of Aden in 2008. Then in December 2009, retired Admiral Yuan Zhuo talked about a possible overseas base or facility. 2010, a China State Oceanic Administrative Report alluded to plans for building aircraft carriers. By 2012, China was ready to move in the Indian Ocean. A maritime rights and interest leading group was established inside the Communist Party. Report to the 18th Party Congress in the same year saw the first official reference to building China into a sea power nation. Plan was presented in the 21st Century Maritime Belt, as you all know, BRI, in 2013 in Jakarta. It was, of course, presented as a kind of a trading and financial kind of a program to guise its geopolitical intent. Now, while some Chinese observers advanced the idea of a harmonious Ocean. In May 2014, three Chinese researchers, in fact, recently our ex-Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, who is a China expert, China-knowing diplomat, he wrote that three Chinese researchers in the China Naval Research Institute laid out the game plan for the Indian Ocean. It's called the strategic scenario in the Indian Ocean and the expansion of Chinese naval power. It acknowledges, of course, the United States hegemony and Indian regional influence in the Indian Ocean. It posed challenges for Chinese expansion into the Indian Navy, but it also talked about how to overcome those deficiencies. You know, the deficiencies that China, these three researchers mentioned at that time, is that China is not a littoral state in the Indian Ocean. Second, passage through key maritime straits, that is Straits of Malacca, could easily be blocked. And the third, possibility of US-India cooperation against China. Now, how to overcome those deficiencies, according to these authors? One, carefully selecting sites to build ports. Djibouti, Gwadar, Hambantota, Sittwe, Seychelles were specifically mentioned in that particular article by the three researchers. And then secondly, first, carefully selecting sites. Secondly, by conducting activities in a very low manner to reduce military color as much as possible. Three, by not unnerving India and America, showing cooperation in the Indian Ocean first, and then slowly penetrating into the Indian Ocean, beginning with detailed maritime surveys, ocean mapping, human and disaster relief, port construction, and so on. The Chinese have actually moved along these lines. Another point about the BRI, military and geostrategic intent, a Chinese scholar, again, Vijay Gokhale has mentioned, the Chinese scholar at Jiaotong University has recently acknowledged that the dual use of ports are likely to support future military projections. Chinese naval civilian vessels routinely conduct surveys in the EEZ of littoral states. Then in January 20, the Chinese Navy conducted tripartite naval exercises with Russia and Iran in Arabian Sea. China has the largest warship building program in the world at the moment. Now, with these few words, as an introduction to the question that I posed initially, I'll now request the first panelist, Vice Admiral Pradeep Kashiva, to give a broad outline of the main theme about the Indo-Pacific and why there's so much talk about this concept of Indo-Pacific and how it could resolve some of the issues that are inherent within the problems that we have been talking about. To Admiral Pradeep Kashiva.
At the outset, I would like to thank the Tillotoma Foundation and Professor Baladas Ghoshal for inviting me to this webinar. A warm hello to co-panelists, many of whom I remember from earlier discussions, and also to the distinguished audience that we cannot see. I'm sure all of us are equally unhappy about not being able to physically meet, sit across the table, and discuss issues. But COVID-19 has changed many normals. Professor Baladas Ghoshal has given a well-rounded sort of a view and posed the question, why is there turbulence in Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific region, and how does China fit into this? Well, so I would need to cover actually the background, which is all well known, but I'll just quickly go over that it was something which was coming it was in the process, in the making, really all this while historically. To start with, stable maritime domain is essential for prosperity of the littoral states and all those who trade across the seas. That means all stakeholders, whether they are resident or non-resident. 50 years ago, the US had seamlessly slid into Indian Ocean as the regional maritime hegemon when the British decided to withdraw from east of Suez after dominating the maritime scene here for 150 years. The regional arrangement of one principal maritime muscle worked well. But its direct consequence was that this vast seascape did not evolve its own region-wide identity, its own security architecture, or develop any narrative of regional cooperation. Now, this was the flip side of the stability which this region enjoyed. In the last decade, the US has recalibrated its posture in the Indo-Pacific from pivot to rebalance to dumping both and pushing other stakeholders for load bearing. US Navy has been relatively shrinking in size and influence in the region, even though it is not about to demit either the responsibility or the scene anytime soon. Parallelly, the global economic center of gravity has been shifting eastwards since China replaced Japan as the second largest economy. As its economy grew, authoritarian China also made advancements in technology to become an industrial and military giant. Even if presently China's parity with the US is somewhat distant, actually quite distant, it has developed substantial asymmetry to unsettle the world's sole surviving superpower. China's Western maritime access to industrial raw material, energy and markets routes through the Malacca Strait, as Professor Ghoshal has just mentioned. It has sought to reduce this vulnerability through dissuasion as well as persuasion. In the first part, its 9-dash line claim over 80% of South China Sea seeks absolute domination. In the second part, it seeks to trump geography through China-Pakistan economic corridor for Western China to access Arabian Sea and China-Myanmar economic corridor for Kunming to access Bay of Bengal. China is also establishing naval bases in Djibouti and Gwadar, besides actively buying her security elsewhere in Indian Ocean littoral through massive investments in infrastructure development and large-scale transfers of military hardware. All this enables positioning of specialists, labors, equipment, and security paraphernalia on foreign soil. PLA Navy will need to base large numbers and variety in Indian Ocean so as to minimize the long distance back and forth from mainland, which current forays and deployments entail. Maintenance support facilities and other infrastructure development for dependents would also be usable for the PLA Navy to start with. Once the concept is accepted, the logical next step would be to create facilities for PLA Navy and allow the hosts to use them as a favor. Indian Ocean is thus poised to experience turbulence. Taking it also into account the revisionist China's aggressive posturing in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific, the Indo-Pacific sea space as a whole is becoming increasingly unstable. So this is the turbulence which is in the offing. Now, the other issue I will touch upon as sought by Professor Ghoshal was, what are the prospects for proposed quadrilateral security dialogue to play a stabilizing role? So as mentioned, US Navy has been a stabilizing influence for more than 50 years. With the eastward shift of global economic center of gravity, rapidly diminishing US domestic appetite for global responsibilities, and the rise of an expansionist China, there is greater need today than ever before for a collaborative security framework. In the wake of 2004 tsunami, Indian Navy had swiftly deployed more than 30 ships and dozens of fixed-wing as well as rotary-wing aircraft, first on its own and later in coordination with US, Japan, Australia to aid maritime neighbors. This contributed significantly, we believe, in inspiring Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to propose quadrilateral security dialogue or Quad for an Asian arc of democracies to come together. It had a brief first iteration, but all members, each for own reasons, backed off within a year. This was revived at senior officials level in 2017 for cooperation to promote peace, stability, and prosperity. It, however, had no agreed official definition, and consequently, there were many versions to it. In 2018 meeting of senior officials, they dropped reference to quadrilateral and noted that the countries supported a free, open, prosperous, and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. Parleys are continuing behind closed doors. Aggressive Chinese posturing in all unilaterally claimed as well as disputed land and sea areas and her rapidly building military capability in Indian Ocean requires pragmatic, definitive action by the stakeholders, resident as well as non-resident. The Quad founder members are well positioned to draw up the blueprint of an inclusive regional framework for this. Admittedly, the Duer framework focused on ensuring maritime security would not be an alliance such as NATO, but will certainly be a lot more than IORA, Indian Ocean Naval Chiefs Conclave IONS, the ASEAN Regional Forum, WPNS, other such consultation and dialogue platforms which are currently in place. Its vision statement would need to have ample clarity about modalities and also load-bearing responsibilities. The membership should be open to all stakeholders who share the objectives, anxieties, and capabilities. In addition to the four founders, names of European Union as a trading bloc, France, Indonesia, Vietnam readily come to mind. As it is difficult to cobble up a large group of broad spectrum cooperation, this Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Framework could comprise subsets of bilateral and small number multilateral sub-regional groupings. Formalization of credible, what I'm calling the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Framework or TIP MSF, would persuade the fence-sitter stakeholders to undertake cost-benefit analyses, not simply whether there is more to gain by joining or less to lose by staying out. They will also factor in the complex dynamic of disruptive realities evidenced by China's declared intention and demonstrated actions. A free, open, prosperous, and inclusive Indo-Pacific region serving the long-term interests of all countries in the region and indeed of all stakeholders should by definition be also open for China to join. If it does, its acceptance of the Charter would make the world an infinitely safer place. If, on the other hand, it does not, thereby repudiating the Charter, at least the bogus assurance of peaceful rise would be given a formal burial. Thank you, Professor Bhujal.
Thank you, Pradeep. That was an excellent overview of the issues involved. And I think the next speaker I would request is Professor Neo from Myanmar. And I would like Professor Neo to focus on certain issues, particularly with Myanmar's participation in the BRI, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. And, although China has been trying to push Myanmar also to restore the Mitsone Dam, but somehow Myanmar has resisted that. And secondly, few weeks back rather, some Chinese arms were caught on the Thai-Myanmar border. I think these arms were actually directed towards, or at least were meant for, supporting the Arakan army. And Myanmar's chief of the armed forces had, in fact, 3 weeks back, had expressed his anguish as well as his frustration with the Chinese. So, to Professor Neo.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
My, however, I am very happy to meet with my old friends, yeah, especially from Colombo. A long time no see. Sorry. I am not an expert on these issues, but I'm here to learn mostly from you. But as our chair mentioned, I would like to touch some of the things. And Myanmar's stand or Myanmar-China relationship. As you can imagine that Myanmar cannot be stay away from neighboring countries, especially China and India. It is quite delicate to deal with these countries. Unfortunately, or fortunately, China is biggest investor in Myanmar. That is the fact. And one of the biggest trading partners and also biggest lender. So most of the scholars focus on these issues, and they thought that there is a big influence on Myanmar from China. But I will share some of my experience. China began closer to Myanmar than other countries, not out of our choice, out of necessity. Right, it is out of necessity. For Myanmar, China is a friend in need, especially at the UN General Assembly or trade or investment. But we are not sure China is a friend indeed. Because there is all once China brings some ethnic armed groups to the discussion table. China collected these groups, organized these groups at Kunming, and then fly into Nibio. So how can this happen? Like something like China is the headquarters of armed ethnic groups. That is what we see. And last year, if I remember well, Hua ethnic groups show their force, their development. Can you imagine? Most of the weapons are made by China. So our scholars, a lot of our scholars focus on this Chinese-made weapons and support of China to ethnic armed groups. But China never accept these facts. they see that, they saw that they never supported these armed groups. And there is no relationship with these weapons of Chinese-made weapons in the hand of ethnic groups. So quite confusing and quite complex. But can you imagine that in 2000, after 2015, Myanmar made a lot of reforms. And at that time, China lagged behind. China cannot understand Myanmar, and they are quite surprised to learn that Mekong project totally postponed. Totally postponed. How many years? No one knows. Maybe government knows. I don't. Chinese 10 projects now already postponed for 10 years. 10 years. Yeah. Sort of unlimited postpone. And they are quite surprised that and not happy with that. And you frequently mention about China-Myanmar economic corridor, mostly with Chaochu project, Chaochu port project.
Right.
Yeah. We can change some contracts made with China. For example, Chaochu Special Economic Zone. Initially, China's share is 85%, and Myanmar's side is just 15%. But under the new NLD, National League for Democracy government, it becomes 70 to 30. 70 for China and 30 for Myanmar. Or we can also reduce the size of that project from 7.5 billion to 1.3 billion. What I would like to show you is that we have some sort of influence from China, but not that big influence. We are recessive. And very recently, even during COVID, China wished to speed up China-Myanmar economic corridor, but we are weak. It is our project, and we are doing at our own space, our own pace, our own speed. So, and you can imagine that these are some of the examples. We are not strong enough to be stand alone against a big neighbor, but it doesn't mean we will ignore our national interests and national voice. Our government is trying to balance the national interest and national voice. You can imagine that we become a democratic country, and we need to take care of public voices. Generally speaking, most of Myanmar public they have anti-Chinese sentiment. But on the other hand, we need to have Chinese investment, which is quite controversial, you can imagine. But because, as I mentioned you earlier, we have no choice. There is not much investment from Western countries. So we wish and we try to diversify our dependence on China. And unfortunately, until now, we met with little success. I think what we are doing is based on Myanmar's foreign policy, active, independent, and non-aligned. We need to balance the influence of Western countries with the interest of I'm not quite clear whether it is Indian Ocean is important for China or not. That is not my area of expertise. I just share my experience with Myanmar's dealing with China. Thank you, sir. Thank you all.
Oh, thank you, Professor Liu. I think you did give a proper perspective on Myanmar. Of course, one can always ask questions on various aspects of Myanmar, but still, I thought that was a good presentation.
Thank you.
I think the next in our list is Dr. David Brewster, Australia, one of the major stakeholders in the Indian Ocean, and also a country which has recently been a major target of China's ire. So I thought David would be able to give a proper perspective and what he thinks, not only just from an Australian perspective, but just what he thinks about the China's position in the Indian Ocean and how to sort of, resolve, how to deal with that particular issue. Thank you. David. Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, apologies.
Get it.
And thanks for, it's a great pleasure to be here. So today I'm going to talk about China's approach to the Indian Ocean, some developments in the Australia-China relationship, and then the impact of COVID on China's strategy in the next few years. So obviously the COVID crisis is still playing out, and so we can't really be sure of much, but the appearance at least is that for South Asia and the rest of the Indian Ocean region, the health impacts are probably less significant than was originally feared. But the economic picture for the region, I think, is much less optimistic. And so most major Indian Ocean states are going to be severely impacted by falling commodity prices and tourism. And in future, in the coming years, we are going to see this translate almost certainly into political and strategic instability. And the question is, what role is China going to have in that instability? So I'll come back to that question a bit later and just say a few words about the Australia-China relationship. We've seen a very significant deterioration in the relationship in the last 6 months from a number of factors, including Australia's efforts to prevent foreign interference in its domestic political system. And most particularly, the biggest recent incident was Australia's sponsorship of the WHO resolution for an independent inquiry into the origins of the novel coronavirus, which Beijing took great exception to. So Beijing has responded with sanctions on imports of Australian agricultural products and threats to prevent Chinese students and tourists returning to Australia after the COVID crisis, although that at the moment, for obvious reasons, that's more theoretical than actual. And I think there's little doubt that this will have a significant impact on Australia's trade. But Australia's making efforts to diversify its trading relationships, and we shouldn't overstate the impact of it. In many ways, China needs Australian resources just as much as it operates as a customer. So we've seen, for example, a huge increase in Chinese imports of iron ore in the last 6 months to record levels. And I think no one talks about that, but that's a sort of an indication of China actually needing Australian resources more than it wishes to think. And in fact, I think the balance of trade has shifted in Australia's favour. So that's just as a side note. But I think you could see the Australia-China relationship is somewhat an equivalent to the India-China relationship in terms of what's been happening over the last few months. Australia's response has been fairly steadfast, although it's sought to avoid some of the inflammatory language and provocations we've seen out of the Trump administration in the context of the US election. One major development for Australia is that the government announced a major increase in defence spending, an additional $270 billion over the next 10 years, in addition to the existing defence spending. And that's been largely focused on power projection and long-range deterrent capabilities, such as long-range missiles. And so there's a view of trying to keep any potential adversary a long way away from the Australian continent. In announcing that spending, the government took quite a candid and very, very pessimistic view of the regional security situation. There was a lot of talk about the 1930s and the prospects, implicitly the prospects for a major conflict coming on. Just turning to the Indian Ocean region, as in conjunction with this change in the China relationship, Australia has made a significant additional focus on the Pacific, and that is to a significant extent driven by concerns about growing Chinese influence among Pacific islands. Australia is still by far the largest aid donor in the region by really quite a significant factor, but nevertheless, there were concerns about growing Chinese influence, and this has redirected Australian attention, Australian aid and diplomatic resources away from other regions, including the Indian Ocean region, towards the Pacific. So those of us who are focused on the Indian Ocean are somewhat worried about that. One thing that I think, a good thing that might have come out of these recent events is a much greater focus on the Quad, a view that the members of the Quad, in particular India, will devote greater attention and resources to building it as perhaps a more credible grouping. And as part of this, as many of us will see, there's some talk about Australia being invited to join the Malabar naval exercises. I see that as largely a symbolic rather than a substantive development if it was to come to pass, but it would actually be, I think, from my perspective, an important indication of to what extent India feels itself able to overcome its concerns about China and provoking China, which was the key reason why Australia wasn't being requested to participate previously. That's really a matter for India, and I can understand different balances in that decision. Let me just turn to China's actions in the Indian Ocean. I think the first point is that we haven't seen significant incidents of assertiveness from China in the Indian Ocean over the last 6 months or so, in the same way that we've seen assertiveness in the Himalayas, South China Sea, East China Sea, and Taiwan and Hong Kong, and the list is a long one. And I think, I find this somewhat surprising if we interpret China's assertiveness as a sort of a general expansionism on all fronts. Perhaps the partnership with Iran announced in recent weeks may be a major turning point and a major development in China's presence in the Indian Ocean. I think it's a little too early to see. Personally, I'm a little skeptical that Iran would allow itself to be used as a patsy by China in terms of hosting Chinese military forces on its soil. But, no one can be sure of that yet, I don't think. And in any event, I'm sure the Iran would find the threat of that potentially useful in leveraging its position. One major point I did want to make is the extent to which the COVID crisis will significantly alter the BRI, the economics of the BRI, and therefore will become a major factor in China's future presence. Obviously, we're going to see a major economic downturn in the region and globally, which will reduce the need for new infrastructure, among other things. And so we're going to see, I expect, many planned projects put into the deep freeze. And of course, many regional states will also find it difficult to repay existing debt loads. And so this will put China, or force China, into a decision of to what extent it provides new loans to existing local partners, it reschedules existing loans, or potentially forecloses on debts and potentially takes control of existing infrastructure. I don't think that, I think it's a little too early to say what China's strategy will be in this respect. With the exception of Pakistan, I think Pakistan has seen an opportunity to firstly double down on the CPEC and use the COVID crisis as an opportunity to reschedule a lot of its debt repayments. Fine, good on Pakistan. And I think those in Islamabad realised that Beijing could hardly say no to those requests, or many of those requests. And so they used it as a bit of an opportunity. But I don't, it's not clear to me what China's strategy will be elsewhere in the Indian Ocean. We've seen some concessional loans or rescheduling occurring in a few countries such as Sri Lanka and Maldives, but I personally haven't seen China seeking to take advantage of distress of debtors in terms of taking control of local infrastructure or seeking other strategic advantage in connection with this debt rescheduling. It may well happen in coming weeks and months, but I'm not sure that we're seeing it yet. The one important rider I attach to all this is that India is going to find it very, very hard to compete with China in the region, and even harder than previously. I think obviously India is facing a significant economic downturn that will make funding very, very difficult, and it'll make it extremely difficult, I think, for India to step in to assist smaller countries in the region in the same way that it did in Maldives last year, for example, or the year before last, when it was able to offer large funding to the Maldives to essentially more or less replace Chinese loans. I just cannot see that happening in current circumstances. Perhaps Japan will be able to come provide financial assistance in that respect, but certainly not India. And so I see much of the jostling and competition in the region between China and India, and China and other countries, as very much focused around the BRI and what the consequences, the economic consequences of COVID will be for the BRI. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I think that was again an excellent presentation, very precise, to the point. I think our next speaker in the line is Dr. Jayanath Kolumbage, with his Sri Lankan viewpoint, how Sri Lanka looks at the whole issue of China's interest in the Indian Ocean, as well as on some of the issues involving the internal political processes as well, because there have been talk about China also interfering in the internal political development in Sri Lanka, particularly in the context of the coming elections. But those are just the sidelines of the issues. And it's up to Dr. Jayanath to focus on what he feels should be Sri Lanka's perspective on the Indian Ocean. Dr. Jayanath Kolumbage.
Okay, good evening, I don't know whether it is good morning to some, and it's wonderful to see everybody. And, we really miss seeing each other, sitting in one room, discussing, arguing, and come to whatever conclusion. But I think this is the second best that we can do. So let me start. Of course, I'm conscious about the time as well. Now, I think the question is something which I would avoid answering because when I look at the list of the speakers here, I think except Myanmar and Sri Lanka, other countries are sort of having more common denominators vis-a-vis China than Myanmar and Sri Lanka. Because Sri Lanka is a very small country in this game. However, unfortunately, we feel at times that Sri Lanka is becoming the playground upon which the strategic game by the major players are being played, right? So we are not very happy by being the playground. Either we want to be a player in a team, or at least we want to be the line referee if we can't be the main referee. So we are not very comfortable in this situation, what is taking place in the Indian Ocean, because the strategic game is being played upon the soil and the waters around Sri Lanka practically on a day-to-day basis. So that is what I say, why I said I would rather not answer or give you a direct answer to the question because it's very difficult. And I must say, I'm not representing the view of the government. This is my view, or my own view. And I mentioned about the soccer ground. And has things changed during the COVID? Or I'm reluctant to call this the post-COVID world, because I think we are not yet there. Now, only thing is from a Sri Lankan perspective, now the COVID has really given us many aspects to rethink our position, rethink our economic model, rethink what we have been doing over a long period of time. We embrace the globalization, but then we saw during the COVID, it started globalization. Instead of becoming a globalized world, everything slowed down, right? So whether it is going to be a trend or whether it is coming back to the globalization, we have to wait and see. And also, we do see a different world order during the post-COVID time. And we even, these are the thinking I'm talking about in Sri Lanka, vis-a-vis the region, the Indian Ocean, and also other players. Now here, in the region, the nationalism, especially in Sri Lanka, the nationalism has come forward during the time of COVID, because we felt that we cannot depend on the international system, we cannot depend on the international organization, we cannot depend on the multilateral organization, but we have to find our own battle. Now, when we embark on the COVID control, actually many countries did lend the support. Two countries stand out. Who are these two countries? India and China. Now, India donated plane loads of medicine items, and China did the same. So then we are now asking the question, are we experiencing the diplomacy through health diplomacy, so to say, the health diplomacy in this region? Now, also, we are asking the question, who is a superpower from Sri Lankan point of view? Is it a country which is having military might? Is it a country which is having economic might, international diplomatic might, or a country which can protect its own citizens? So this is a question that we are asking, because we actually gave our top priority to saving lives. Everything else, the economy was secondary, the development was secondary, but saving life was the #1 priority which we experienced in Sri Lanka. So that's what I mentioned, that we question now, what is the world going to be? And this actually has given rise to a feeling in Sri Lanka that our economic model was wrong, because we had an import-oriented economy. We take a container from, about 35 to 40% of containers transiting through Sri Lanka are coming from India, right? Now, I would always say Port of Colombo is the second biggest port for India after Jawaharlal Nehru Trust. So that means we were not producing anything. We were just doing a business. We were taking something and sending to another destination. So our economic model, there is room for improvement in that economic model, or to rethink our economic model. Now that has given rise to two things. One is food security, and the other one is medicine security. Because we did not produce enough food, we did not produce enough medicine, so we did not have security in those things. So we had major issues in those two areas. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me focus on some of the questions I think Ambassador Ghoshal also mentioned, and David Brewster also brought this out, and Admiral Pradeep also mentioned. Is Hambantota port a Chinese port, right? To me, or to anyone in Sri Lankan, we don't like that term. We would like to say it is a Sri Lankan port. Of course, built by the China, and 85% stakes are with China at the moment. But the question that Hambantota port is not a Chinese port. And then the second question is whether Hambantota port can be used for military purposes by China against another country. And the answer there again is no way. We will never allow a single inch of our land or ocean to be used by one country against another country. That is period. We are not going to allow. Now, David knows the figures that I'm always talking about, the warships visiting Sri Lanka. Now I have the little updated figures coming from 2009 to 2020. We have had 502 warships visiting Sri Lanka. And ladies and gentlemen, highest number are from our neighbor India, that is 107 warships. And that's something nice, that's something great. We are very happy about it. But then the question, is China using Sri Lanka as a military outpost? If you go down the ladder, only 41 warships have visited Sri Lanka during the time period 2008 to 2020. So that means that we will not allow anyone, especially to be a threat to India. I have to reiterate that, because we do understand India's strategic security concerns, and we don't want to be, we will not be, and we can't afford to be a strategic security threat to India. That's period. So that means we will never allow anyone to do anything against India using Sri Lanka. Then, of course, my preamble, description of the pretty girl syndrome. I mentioned about the football field that we are being used, but we are also the pretty girl receiving so many gifts. Australia gave us 2 Bay-class vessels. India built 2 OPVs. America gave us a frigate or Coast Guard cutter. China gave us a frigate. Japan gave us 2 boats. So this pretty girl is receiving so many ships, right? Now this is a predicament, although it looks like a good thing. You know, when a lady is receiving so many gifts, you know, either she has to give the word to one of them, right? Or at the end, she may lose all. So this is kind of a situation that Sri Lanka is in. Then, of course, we are operating through this Indo-Pacific construct, right? Now, Admiral Harry Harris, when he visited Colombo in 2016, he mentioned Sri Lanka has 3 distinct advantages: location, location, and location. We are a very small country. We are not a major power. We are not a superpower, but we are in a strategically important location. Now, the problem is we have a huge asymmetry with other countries because we are so small, our budget is small, our foreign revenue is so small, our population is so small. So the only way that we think is that we have to have is a rules-based maritime order in the region, so that our asymmetry by being small can be overcome. Now, Sri Lanka's strategic neighborhood, the government in power today is very conscious about India's strategic security aspirations. Now I will come to what do we really want in the Indian Ocean and in Sri Lanka. Current government has based its effort in 3 pillars. Number 1, national security. You know, we were a country which was battered for 30 years by terrorism, and we won against the most ruthless terrorist organization declared by the FBI in 2009. And thereafter, what did we do? we paid very little attention to national security, and 2019, April 21st, the Islamic terrorists created havoc in the country. So therefore, national security is priority for us. Then economic development, we are doing very badly economically. We are not doing very well in the economic field. But now we are 100% sure we don't want to take loans. Because if you take loan, you have to repay the loan, and there may be certain other conditions attached to it. So we don't want loans. We only want foreign direct investment. In that, we want multiple foreign direct investment. We want Australia to come, Singapore to come, India to come, and UK to come, anyone to come and invest. But no more loans. We will not take loans, but we can go for joint venture. We can go for build, operate, transfer. We can go for whatever the model, but no loans for the country, because we are really stuck with a huge loan deficit, and we don't want. And the third one, because in order to manage, is the foreign policy. So these are the three pillars of this government. Now, the president has repeatedly said in New Delhi and in Colombo, neutrality is Sri Lanka's forte. We want to be a neutral country. We don't want to be part of any major power bloc, and we don't want to be caught up in the power struggle. And the fourth one is we don't want to give control of our strategic national assets to any country. And here I would say giving Hambantota port for 99-year lease to China Merchant Port Holding is wrong. I mean, I would say it in any forum. It was a mistake we did. We shouldn't have given, right? So therefore, now the policy is that we will not give our strategic national assets to by total control to any foreign power. So India is so close to us. India is very close strategically across the ocean. By air, it takes less than 2 minutes to cross the international maritime boundary line. A ship takes only half an hour. So we are pretty much within the Indian maritime and air security umbrella. So we are very mindful. We don't want to be that aircraft carrier which Ambassador Shivashankar Menon mentioned in his book Choices. We want to ensure that no one uses Sri Lanka against another country, and especially so India, because we are geographically so close to India. Now India, and also if you ask me, is China a major factor in Sri Lanka? The straightaway answer is no. But then if you ask me, is America or India a major factor in the Sri Lanka's discussion? And unfortunately, my answer is yes. America is a major concern or a major factor in the debate in Sri Lanka, and so to say India as well. But a lot of good things have happened between India and relations. I believe the leadership now understand each other much better than they did few years ago. So India is the bigger player, big brother. I mean, Foreign Minister Jayashankar said it is quite natural for a small country to feel that India is big. That's you can't avoid it. But at the same time, we need more confidence building measure. And Australia, although they are quite far away, we find a lot of things in common with Australia. At least our search and rescue borders coincide in the Indian Ocean. So there again, we are neighbors. So one thing we need to remember is Sri Lanka cannot remain poor forever. We need foreign direct investment. We need capacity development. And who has that capacity to support us? I think David Brewster brought this out, whether India has that capacity economically to match. No, we don't expect anyone to match. I mean, yes, you're right. I'm not deferring your argument, but what we see is we don't want anyone to match, but we want every country to invest in Sri Lanka. Because what we have experienced in Sri Lanka is if you leave a vacuum here, because our development needs are huge, but if you leave a vacuum here, somebody will fill that vacuum. So don't leave a vacuum, be with us, and let us not be the soccer field that everyone is playing the game on. Either we join a team or we become at least the line referee. If we can't be the main referee, at least the line referee. So I rest my case, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer time. Thank you very much.
Oh, That was an excellent exposition of the Sri Lankan position. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. That was an excellent exposition of the Sri Lankan position. But I want to assure Dr. Jayannath, India doesn't want to be a big brother. It can be an elder brother. Elder brother and big brothers are two different concepts. I think in Indian culture, or so maybe in Sri Lankan culture, an elder brother has different connotation. So India would like to be an elder brother, not a big brother. Anyway, now I think the next in line is Abhijit. I think I'll bring an Indian now again to give his perspective of the Indian Ocean. And I think all three Indian expositions should be different from each other, to my mind. It's not the same. So, Abhijit, please come in.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yeah. Now.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be a part of this very interesting panel. And I have to say that I have been quite enlightened by some of the views of the speakers before me. What I thought today is that I'm going to try and present a realist Indian view of China, because the question in front of us is that what would aggressive, belligerent China look like in the Indian Ocean? And of course, I'm going to try and change it with a bit of pragmatism. Now, the essential proposition is that to evaluate the challenge that China poses in the Indian Ocean, and I would like to reiterate that this is really a challenge more for India than it is for some of the other regional states, I think it's important to answer three big questions. First, what are China's interests in the Indian Ocean? Second, what is the Chinese strategy to meet its objectives in this vast space? And third, and most importantly, what would be the implications of a confident and more dominant China for India in the Indian Ocean region? Now, it is well known, and it has been brought out by some of the previous speakers also, that China's essential goals in the Indian Ocean are actually commercial and economic. What they actually want to do is to protect their supply lines, the oil and gas flows, the material and mineral shipments that pass through the vital sea lanes. But the fact also is that China has some vital investments in the Indian Ocean, in Africa, in the Gulf region, in South Asia and Pakistan. And it's important for the Chinese to be able to protect those investments and importantly to service its markets, service markets and protect markets in Europe. And so the Chinese actually go to great lengths to somehow assure Indian observers, Indian analysts, that what they really want in the region is really access, material, and markets, and that they really don't intend to be a geopolitical player in the region. But of course, a lot of us Indian observers aren't quite convinced. And the reason is that we somehow sense that what the Chinese actually want is a little more than that. What they want is influence in the region. And the reason China wants influence in the region, this is our assessment, is that the Indian Ocean region is a vital part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And we know the Belt and Road Initiative is a signature endeavor, a signature project of President Xi Jinping, and that the Chinese have invested a lot in this project. And therefore, their intention also is to somehow incrementally grow their influence in this area. Now, a term that I came across recently and something that I now am beginning to subscribe to, the Chinese strategy, which is the second question. What's the Chinese strategy in the Indian Ocean region? The Chinese strategy is one of stakeholdership by stealth, which means that grow your presence incrementally, progressively in the space. This, in the view of some observers in India, is another version of salami slicing. Salami slicing that we see happen in the South China Sea. Of course, the difference being that in the South China Sea, it's salami slicing of territory, whereas in the Indian Ocean, this is salami slicing of influence, of markets, of market equity, and to incrementally establish China as a dominant geopolitical player, as a dominant geoeconomic player in the region, to establish China's strategic stakes in the space, and to get the region to accept China in the same way as it would accept another global power, say as the US. So the Chinese take really is that we are a global power in the mold of the US. If the US can have its navy, if the US can have its presence all over the world, so can we. There's nothing ominous about it. There's nothing that's really amiss about our efforts to grow our presence in the region. So then this brings us to a third, rather worrisome aspect of what we see happen in the Bay of Bengal. In the Bay of Bengal, what we see is that China normally has this incremental strategy of growing its presence, and we know of Admiral Colombo spoke of Sri Lanka and Hambantota, and the fact that the Sri Lankans somewhere do regret the fact that the port, that just so many assets in the port were somehow handed over to the Chinese. But there are other countries in the region like Bangladesh, perhaps to a degree Myanmar, even Thailand, that are not very happy with the arrangements they have with the Chinese, because the Chinese are trying to somehow establish a greater control over the assets in this region. Now, I'm not going to go into debt traps and dependency traps. That is a term that skeptical Indians have, I think, invented, and a term that some of the regional states find pretty derogatory. But the fact of the matter is that China does have some degree of control over the political processes, over the economic processes in some of these states. And some of these states have a really close relationship with India, and they somehow find themselves in this invidious position where when they have to balance themselves between India and China, and really, in a sense, apologize to India for the huge influence that China is gathering in these countries. So that this is the third dimension of China's growing presence in the region, that it does so slowly, organically. Even the demand that China has created for the Chinese military in the region is organic. It's not as if the Chinese have come and taken over the space, but because the Chinese have investments in the region, they create a logic, a rationale for positioning their forces in the region, something that a country like India feels very hard to counter. Combine this with the fact that there's so many arms sales that's happening. The fact that the Pakistanis will receive 6 Yuan-class submarines, the fact that the Bangladeshis already have 3 Ming-class submarines, the Thai Navy was supposed to get 3 Chinese submarines. They probably will now get just 1, but they're getting an amphibious warship. The Sri Lankans have been gifted a corvette. And the fact is the Chinese are also going to probably persuade the Thai government to let them build the Kra Canal. Plus the fact that that in Cambodia, we have a kind of a Chinese base that's developing. So if you marry all of these developments together, if you take them all together, it does suggest a greater Chinese growing footprint in the Bay of Bengal. And I would make the same argument for the Arabian Sea. Look at what's happened in Iran. If you don't want to talk about Gwadar, a $400 billion deal with China. China is going to have presence all along the Persian Gulf, in places like Chabahar, in places like Jassak, even in other ports inside the Persian Gulf. And so that means that the Chinese have, again, succeeded some ways in growing their presence from the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea into the Persian Gulf, which, again, is incremental, it's slow, it's below the radar. Nobody knows that whether China will have military assets in the region or not, but the fact is that China will be a player in the space. The third and most important question for us now is, what is the implication of a growing China for Indian interests in the region? Before I try and answer this question, let me just try and do a little bit of background setting. You know, in the wake of the Galwan crisis, there is really a sense that India-China relations are at the lowest point ever. In the sense after the 1962 war, there is a great deal of nationalism that we are seeing both in India and in China. If we were to read the Global Times and what they have to say about Indian aggression as they see it, there is a great deal of emotional angst that we are seeing in the media. Trust is at its lowest, and really there is a sense that there is a spiral of escalation that seems to be now building up, and this could result in a further skirmish, either on land or maybe at sea. Now, some say that unlike land, where the PLA has an advantage in terms of terrain, in terms of troop strength, and in terms of infrastructure, the seas favor India. The fact is that India has a great deal of presence in the Eastern Indian Ocean region. We have the position of the Andamans that overlook the 10-degree channel through which a lot of east-west trade flows, and also the fact that that we can use our assets in the Andamans to actually interdict Chinese trade that's coming out of the Malacca Straits and traversing through the critical sea lanes in the Andaman Sea. Indeed, what we've seen in recent days is that the Indian Navy has actually grown its presence just in the past 2 weeks in this region. We know for a fact that there is this thing that's called the mission-based deployments that are happening in full swing, where India has actually been sending warships to patrol the choke points, and the number of not just Malacca Straits, but even other straits like the Lombok, the Sunda. I'm not so sure about the Mumbai Vetar, but there certainly is a great deal of Indian presence in the Andaman Sea. Marry that with the fact that we have now been sending our maritime patrol aircraft, the P-8Is, to do regular patrolling over the region. We are sharing information with the US and our other allies or other partners to know about about whether there are Chinese submarines in the region. And the fact is that we're actually assuming a very aggressive posture in the Eastern Indian Ocean region. Now, I have argued in one of the recent pieces that I wrote for The Hindu that this posture is all well and good, but really this is unsustainable in the long run. And I've said so because really this is going to prove to be in the long run a drain of resources at a time when China has not actually been aggressive in the Eastern Indian Ocean region. So if you actually look at it, the Chinese strategy in the Eastern Indian Ocean region has again been of low-level presence. What we've seen is Chinese intelligence ships, Chinese survey ships, research vessels, fishing boats, mining ships, but really there hasn't been a case of Chinese warships entangling with the Indian Navy or a challenge to India in the territorial seas of the Andamans or Indian trade being in any ways intercepted by the Chinese Navy. The Chinese have very cautiously kept clear of Indian red lines in the space. And so my argument in that article that I wrote some time back was that this really is in the long run going to be unsustainable. One, because of the fact that we are spending just too many resources. Second, what China has very smartly done is that it has shifted the onus of aggression. It has shifted the onus of escalation on the Indian Navy. Since China doesn't have China isn't being aggressive in the space, if the Indian Navy were to show itself to be the more aggressive side, it will definitely have an impact on our general reputation. We've been known to be a balanced, a benign power in the region. We've Southeast Asia, even South Asian countries, Bay of Bengal countries wouldn't by any stretch of imagination say that India has been aggressive. But by assuming such a posture, this is definitely going to have an impact on how the region perceives us. Thirdly, and I think importantly, interdiction of shipping, the manner in which it has been written about by some Indian analysts, is not only is it problematic, but it's also undoable. The fact is that in peacetime, first of all, it's just simply wrong to target Chinese shipping through international traveling on the high seas and through an international straits. Secondly, this is going to entail a terrible cost to neutrals. There are a lot of neutral countries, third countries, whose cargo travels on Chinese flagged vessels. Are we going to target them? If we are going to target them, again, this is going to have a cost to our reputation. So what I'm arguing in that piece is that it's all good and well to have a assertive posture in the Eastern Indian Ocean region. However, in the long run, one, it's going to be hard to sustain that posture. Second, it's just simply going to show us in bad light. Second, and this is one of the last points that I'm going to make, there has also been another suggestion, and David spoke about it for a while, that that means the New Delhi and India might actually militarize the Quad. Now, even when it comes to militarizing the Quad, it does seem to be a sensible option, especially politically. But again, in the article I wrote, I argued that it is sensible, but it does involve a little bit of deep thinking, of consideration of competing imperatives. And the fact of the matter is that we must consider the logic of the Quad for India. The rationale of the Quad for India was very different from what the rationale of the Quad was for the US and other Pacific partners, Japan and Australia. The US and its allies look at the Quad as an instrument that can be used to establish a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. For India, it was important, and it remains important, to build strategic capability. We've got to leverage the Quad to build strategic capability so that we can counter the Chinese in the Indian Ocean region. And that crucially means that we've got to develop underwater capability, underwater assets, to be able to take on the Chinese. What's happened in recent years, in fact, recent months, is that we've developed some aerial surveillance capabilities, which in peacetime is not going to be able to deter the Chinese from sending in their submarines into the Indian Ocean. So the argument that I made there was that that we should definitely consider a military quad. Going forward, it is definitely one of the options on the table, but this is not really the right time for us to do that, because first, we've not been able to develop the strategic capability. Second, the fact is that the US and Japan remain embroiled in the challenges in the Pacific. And really the Indian Ocean is an adjunct. It is an afterthought for these countries. Australia actually remains one of the only countries in the Quad that is willing to partner India in deterring the Chinese in the Indian Ocean region. So again, the apprehension here is that if the Indians sign on to the Quad, India might willy-nilly get drawn into the strategic dynamic of the Pacific. The Quad is not going to help India fight the China challenge in the Indian Ocean region. Conversely, India is going to be drawn into the challenges or into the situation that is developing in the Pacific. So that's something, again, that does not play to Indian interests. Finally, I pointed out in that, and this is something that Professor Ghoshal actually wanted me to speak about, and so I say it, is that the timing of the Quad is going to be extremely important. And the reason I say this, that in military strategy, when we come up with a counter alliance, we time it well. We make sure that the nature of the challenge and the outcome of what we are doing in terms of building the coalition is manifestly clear. What's now happening is that the Chinese actually have not been provocative in the Indian Ocean region. They've really, in a manner of speaking, not really crossed our maritime red lines. And yet, if we amp up and if we form a military quad, it will almost look as if we've done it in premature fashion, and that we've been aggressive at a time that we shouldn't actually be seen to be too aggressive. So again, without hair splitting, the Quad is a good idea, and the military Quad is also a good idea. But I believe that the timing of the Quad is going to be critical in how we meet the China challenge at sea. And I will finally conclude by saying that what the Chinese have been very effectively able to do, you've got to hand it to them, is that they have embarked upon a strategy that has helped them to align ends, ways, and means very effectively. They've not been aggressive in the Indian Ocean region. You don't want to be aggressive because you know you are not a resident power. They have incrementally established a presence in the region. Fighting the Chinese, combating the Chinese requires more than a military strategy. You need a comprehensive strategy that will allow you to combine various elements of national power, such as economic power, diplomatic power, cyber capabilities, and other capabilities to able to have a 360-degree approach in tackling the China challenge in the Indian Ocean. And I will end here. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. A Japanese friend of mine once told me that you Indians are so bright, you cancel out each other. Now, in this case, Abhijit has not canceled out the other perspectives, but definitely has provided a different kind of a perspective and a fresh one, and which I think is worth taking into consideration. Now, after saying this, now I think I'll go outside the region and invite Dr. Satulimaya to speak more on his own perception of the problem, as well as the US perspective of the Indian Ocean security, and this talk about India-China rivalry, or whether Indian Ocean is going to be the next focus of China's strategy in the coming years. Dr. Satulimaya.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ghoshal, and greetings to all of my colleagues across the region and elsewhere. It's a relatively early morning here in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And bring you good greetings. Of course, I would much rather be with you in person, but such is the state of affairs. Look, let me turn on my timer here so I don't exceed the allotted maximum 10 minutes. Obviously, I don't speak for the United States, but will offer you, one analyst perspective. As you all know, I'm at the East-West Center and also at the Center for Naval Analysis. And I thought I'd split my talk basically into two parts. One is sort of an assessment of where I think China is in the Indian Ocean and its approach. And second is to talk about, if you will, other countries' interests, including my own, and responses, particularly focusing on Japan, because I noticed we didn't have a Japan, and many of you know I spent 3.5 years in Japan and do a lot of work on thinking about Japanese strategy in the region. So look, I'll give you, I love this US Marine Corps expression. It's called BLUF, bottom line up front, which is a wonderful kind of acronym that the US Marine Corps has. So my bottom line is really pretty straightforward, given the title of this program. Is the Indian Ocean the next focus of China's bellicosity? And I would say that both in geographical and time frame, it is not. And I wouldn't it as bellicosity. In fact, I think it's in some ways a more structural challenge than bellicosity. And I'm glad to follow Abhijit Singh on this, because I really do assess the challenges, not to be dismissed. Now, let me just preface this by saying my own work in the South China Sea convinces me China's approach in the South China Sea is quite assertive, illegal, and expansive, based on a set of propositions that don't apply in the Indian Ocean. They don't claim territory. They don't have historical claims. They're not seeking to have illegal expressions of sovereignty. So those things, first of all, don't apply. But there are other structural reasons why I think China's Indian Ocean strategy still is something a little bit distant, but growing. First, China's maritime priorities, I assess, are still far closer to home. You can imagine what they are: the Yellow Sea, Taiwan Strait, Sea of Japan, East China Sea, South China Sea. It's in this context, I mean, if you do a hierarchy, the IO is a comparatively less strategic place for China. This does not mean that the PRC / People's Liberation Army Navy will not be assertive or active in the Indian Ocean over time. In fact, I think it will be, as I said, for reasons not of bellicosity per se, but because the conditions, drivers, and capabilities that are likely to shape PRC role in the Indian Ocean are structural and therefore likely to be very difficult to label and counter on grounds of bellicosity alone. So what are some of these conditions and drivers? First, the PRC and PLAN's commitment to being a great maritime power shows no signs of abating. Indeed, I would argue that it's being increasingly fully funded and creating just the kind of capabilities that would make it a great maritime power. And I rely much on Admiral Mike McDivitt. Many of you know retired Admiral Mike McDivitt. Enormous work on this subject, so I really defer to him. But his most recent testimony in January to our Armed Services Committee, he said, China is bent on addressing this by establishing a network of bases or places, what the PLA sometimes called outposts along the Indian Ocean littoral. Djibouti is first. The PLAN has also commissioned or launched over 130 modern ships capable of operating in the Indian Ocean, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, while remaining on station for months at a time. And I emphasize, he writes, today this is far and away the second largest and most modern blue water navy in the world. And he goes on to give details. Please, I refer to you to his books, writings, testimony, publicly available. And so, the first condition, if I could say, about China's future role in the IO is, it's simply, I see no shortage of the capabilities or commitment to being a great blue water navy maritime power. And I quite agree, there may be questions about quality and capability, experience, all kinds of things. But at some point, the scale of China's navy is going to mean that its ships will be regularly encountered everywhere from North America to Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. I mean, I just think that seems to be the state of affairs. He also points out that it's not just the Navy, but operationally, Eventually, the Chinese Air Force will increasingly be drawn into the Indian Ocean in larger numbers than its current small and anti-piracy task forces because of BRI and SLOC anxiety. So it's not just Navy assets, but it could be Air Force assets, and in the future, amphibious and other forces and capability. So the first point is simply to reiterate what China is able to do on the military front in terms of its development, which nothing has to do with bellicosity per se. It has a lot to do with lack of transparency. What is the end state? What is the purpose? What is the goal? But it certainly doesn't have much to do with bellicosity in and of itself. Second, I know there are lots of questions post-COVID and future about supply chains, about decoupling, about issues related to the Chinese economy, but I myself do not see huge low ceilings, very low ceilings on Chinese economic growth. My own assessment is that it will be very, very difficult for countries to decouple from China entirely or substantively. Second, that China, notwithstanding true limitations on ability to do BRI projects, fund external things, lower rates of growth, I do not see any imminent collapse or major slowdown of the Chinese economy. If you look at the Wall Street Journal's reporting just over the last COVID months, you'll see that China has begun to recover. And if you look at the relative rates of GDP decline across EU, Japan, and the US GDP quarterly decline was roughly 9.5%. If I recall correctly, the number in EU was 13.5%. If I recall correctly, the Japanese figure was approximately 25%. And I believe the Chinese figure was roughly, let's admit that the numbers are squidgy, 7 or 8%. But it's already showing signs of recovery and showing signs of expanding trade, et cetera. So I'm not sure we can count on Chinese economic slowdown. Some people have been counseling an imminent collapse of the Chinese economy for approximately 25 to 30 years. There does not appear to be a sign of it. If you look at the new Peterson Institute for International Economics report on Chinese financial coupling with the United States, there is no slowdown. There's no increase in the decoupling of the US-China financial systems. In fact, they're quite significantly intertwined. There is definitely not full implementation of the phase 1 trade deal that the Trump administration has signed, but that does not mean that we are decoupling from the other elements of the relationship yet. Now, over time, it's anyone's guess. The third is the China's BRI. I won't say much about that. The final point I just want to emphasize is the growth of demand pull from the region. In looking at Indian Ocean states from the Eastern African littoral through the Indian Ocean states themselves, through South Asia and Southeast Asia, I see no decline in the desire to do business with China economically, diplomatically, and in limited amounts security. In recent testimony that I made to the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which many of you know is a commission of the United States Congress, I argued, and I put it in this way, that most countries in the region continue to look for opportunities to work and stay on the good side of the United States. Most countries will avoid being on the wrong side of China. In other words, they do want to cooperate with the United States, but they don't want to be on the wrong side of China when there are constructive opportunities for them to do so. And I see no change in that pattern. That brings me to Japan, and I've got 1 minute or so. I think there are a lot of excessive hopes sometimes on Japan in the Indian Ocean. I would make only 2 points. One, Japan is steadily increasing its role and activities, including infrastructure, but some of that infrastructure activities may be jointly done with China in the future in the Indian Ocean region and beyond. And secondly, Japan will have increasing concerns and requirements closer to home. Not only, we always talk about the Senkakus and the East China Sea, but I would also note that Japan will be increasingly concerned about Russian activities in the north as well. So my point is that Japan was definitely increasing its independent deployments with Task Force 151, other activities, some aid packages, but its actual exercises, activities, basing is quite limited in the Indian Ocean. and it's not entirely improbable that Japan and China may cooperate on some activities in the Indian Ocean region and states through its infrastructure projects. So I think that excessive hopes that Japan is going to make a big play into the Indian Ocean, particularly as Mr. Abe reaches the end of his term, may be over expectations of what is likely to occur. So let me leave it at that, and I'd be happy to, of course, take any questions and comments from my colleagues and others. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Satu. I think I used the term bellicosity just to provoke the speakers, just to see the reactions of some of the scholars here. Now, I just have a small sort of query to Satu, since he mentioned about South China Sea. There was recently an article by a journalist, Brazilian journalist called Escobar, saying that, when the two aircraft carriers were recently in the South China Sea, showing its might, China electronically had jammed and practically made it inoperative. Is that a fact? Hello, did you get my question?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. I rely on your foundation to unmute me. So now I'm unmuted. The simple answer is I don't know. One has read those stories. He in the Asia Times, I believe he had carried the story. I simply have no idea exactly what they were able to do in terms of communications on U.S. ships and what they were. The larger question, of course, is in the South China Sea. The more important thing, I think, is that China's claims there are really quite preposterous and illegal, right, and unsupportable. And I think countries know it, and you've seen our recent statement, U.S. government statement on this, but I don't know that that changes the fundamentals of the situation in the South China Sea. The fundamentals, as far as I can see, remain the same, both in terms of Chinese claims and regional responses.
True. Thank you. Thank you. Now I think I'll go on to Dr. Irina to give her own perspective. And I understand that she has done a lot of work on energy in the Chinese sort of need for energy, and also the need for maritime freedom in those areas. So I would be happy if she could give her own perspective on that, and also her own perspective on the Indian Ocean security.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very honored to be in such a company. And I feel a little bit, I have emotions right now. Well, when we think about the two countries, India and China, it is clear that this 21st century will be theirs. And if we talk about what we have right now, we have a China with a global strategy, because if we speak about Belt and Road Initiative, we can say that China has a global strategy right now. And India, which for the moment tries to let's say, to secure its neighborhood, if we talk about East, West, Indian Ocean, and so on. So about the importance of Indian Ocean for China, as I said it in other occasions, it is very important for China to support their economic growth, especially from domestic domestic reasons, and also for external abroad reasons. And for example, energy and everything when we talk about raw materials brought to China are very important. And of course, to secure this transit, they should control a little bit, if we can say like this, this transit. On the other hand, when we talk about naval power and projections of power, we see that those who try to create a global strategy put a very hard emphasis on what is naval capabilities. And from this point of view, I think India has to try to keep the pace with China, because right now is a little bit behind. If we talk about resources invested, about the number, for example, today I saw some statistics, and there were given numbers about subsurface competence. India 17. I don't know if they are really accurate. China 59, 27 to 82 for principal surface competence, and so on. So both countries are very strong in technology. Both countries are let's say very large armies, and a human potential which can support the country's capabilities. And of course, the everything what means technology. And I think here India has great potential in this area. On the other hand, we have a China which now produce its own weapons, and we have India which more imports them from USA, from Russia, and so on. Maybe here it would be, let's say, would be interesting to give more credit to innovation. Everything what means innovation, that we talk about weapons, we talk about information technology, we talk about energy resources, and so on. And another problem is to try to harmonize a little bit the society. I mean, we all know that both countries have some domestic security problems, but I think India is more vulnerable than China right now. And well, on the not the least, we should see this relation India-China in a kind of network with other neighbors, regional actors, and global actors. So India needs to clarify its strategy regarding countries like Russia, Pakistan, South countries, of course, Japan, Australia, and so on. And if we talk about the support which India can seek in the West, I think it should be more visible. For example, here in Europe, people know more about Chinese-European Union relation than about European Union and India bilateral relations. And here can be made some developments in this area, which in the end to help India to to rise a little bit in this regional competition. So there are very many and different, let's say, dimensions we should look for. And I think India's strategy needs to be more carefully and in more directions sought, because if we talk about China for now, for example, they occupied everything they could, in sense that they go on cultural diplomacy, digital diplomacy, assistance diplomacy, economic incentives, and so on. Of course, that India cannot, hasn't the resources, but maybe you should look a little bit, and also other areas of what is the image of the country abroad, and how to strengthen the relations you have with other possible allies, and of course to improve the relation with where they are not quite good with neighbors on and so on. I think you should think a little bit in a long perspective than in a short-term perspective, and maybe yes, and maybe this strategy should be a very pragmatic and a very punctual one for each dimension, which countries we can support and which not. So you can be partners, for example, in a certain in a certain sector of security, and you can have a little bit a decreased involvement in other. I think there should be clarified very well the objectives and which on who we can count at every moment, and for punctual problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Irina. I think the last speaker is Admiral Chatterjee, and he had been actually the commander-in-chief of the Andaman and Nicobar Joint Command. And I think quite a few speakers have mentioned about the importance of the Andaman Nicobar Joint Command and how it could be useful also in terms of dealing with China. So I would request Admiral Chatterjee being the commander-in-chief of the Andaman Nicobar Joint Command. Obviously, he has views sometimes which are a little bit different from others because he has worked internally and knows how it was functioning. So I would give the floor now to Admiral Chatterjee, Pradeep Chatterjee.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Good evening, Chair. Good evening, panelists. And particularly, I would like to convey my respect to Admiral Kaushev, who was my fleet commander and will remain so for a very long time. So, and of course, all the participants. Now, a lot has been said about the Andamans, and Abhijit Singh, Commander Abhijit Singh, has put across his views on the Andamans and how the Andamans would influence operations in that part of the Indian Ocean and Bay of Bengal. But before one really talks about what could be achieved of the Andamans, I think there are certain basic things which if not the panelists, at least the other participants must know. Firstly, that the island chain, it stretches almost 740 kilometers and has a gap of roughly, say, about 160 or 180 odd kilometers in the 6-degree channel. And the lowermost portion, that is the Indira Point, is actually on the focal point of the exit route of the Malacca Strait. And it's quite close to the Aceh province of Indonesia, barely about 80 nautical miles or so. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands, when seen on the map, looks pretty insignificant. But I just want to give a perspective. Well, there are 5 major islands among this entire 537 odd islands. And these 5 main islands are of the size, if one compares with Singapore, one is almost double of Singapore, one is little less than the double of Singapore, and the smallest of these 5 is equal to that of Singapore. Now, why I'm particularly using the word Singapore and the country Singapore, because I want to just say it manifests the kind of economic potential that the islands would have. And if we get our acts correct, then maybe in the next 3, 4, or 5 decades, it will be a different scene altogether. Well, these islands have suffered from a benign neglect, I would like to say utter neglect, and which is the outcome of lack of strategic thought which exists in our country. I think it existed for almost 6.5 decades. And people fail to realize the importance of these islands. While the islands have a substantial military presence in the form of India's first integrated joint command, which was formed in September 2001 on the heels of the Kargil invasion or Kargil conflict which we had with Pakistan. But in this 19 years of survival, it has only done the country proud as the first responder in the 2004 tsunami. But on the flip side, it hasn't achieved much in terms of creation of military infrastructure, etc. On the other hand, you look at China, which has created artificial islands and is filling land 3 acres per day, and has made 7 islands into almost fortresses. And here we have a group of islands on the platter, and it is only in the last 4 or 5 years that some great changes have been made, and things are looking up. Now, the reason is well known. It is because there was not the kind of ownership that was required. After Admiral Arun Prakash he was the first commander-in-chief of that place. And as the command, of course, when I say that the infrastructure wasn't there, but yes, of course, there has been some build-up of infrastructure, but it's not, when you compare it with the kind of infrastructure that China is making in such short time, it's a pittance of what happened in the Andaman Nicobar ever since the independence of India. And it is only in the last 10 years, and more so in the last 5 years, that real infrastructure building has started. In fact, in 2015, the Andaman Nicobar Command sanctioned the maximum number of infrastructure works as compared to any other command of the Army, Air Force, or the Navy in the country. But, you know, the way infrastructure is built in an island, which is, you know, about 700 nautical miles away from the mainland, the pace automatically becomes slow. But the bureaucracy and the red tape is fantastic. For your information, only 6% of the total land which is available in the Andamans, which is roughly about 8,250 square kilometers, is revenue land, 6%. And when I started my job in Andamans, the military was given only 0.6% of the 6%. Plus, there were these turf wars, and which happens in every service. And till, of course, the ruling was obtained from the government that every piece of defense land belongs to the commander-in-chief. So there were doubts initially. So all those, hurdles have been cleared, and now the growth has started. The infrastructure building has started. Ships, submarines, fleets. When I say submarines, it is conventional and nuclear submarines are going there for regular turnarounds. Their defects are being rectified by the dockyards, etc. The most important part is that the growth of two very important issues which are connected with the reach and the power projection from the Andamans. One is the acquisition of the P-8I aircraft. And since I'm quite aware of what the P-8I aircraft was, because I was the deputy chief when we acquired the aircraft and we did the trials. And let me assure you, and without making any bones, that our P-8I aircraft is actually superior than the original P-8I aircraft, and the Americans will now actually have the Indian version of the P-8I in future. And I can talk to people on this details later on, but not on this during this discussion. So the P-8I has brought in substantial reach in terms of the capability, and regular operations from P-8I have started. And look at the Andaman Islands. When I had gone there for the first time, I mean, during the initial part of my tenure, the civil flights which used to come were only from 7 o'clock till 5 o'clock. And before I had quit my job, or rather I retired, we had day and night operations, and at least 5 airlines were operating. So that is the kind of changes that are taking place in the Andamans. The other thing is the Air Force lift capability. The Air Force lift capability in the last decade has gone up considerably. And therefore, this has added to Andaman's power projection capabilities. Now, if you look at the recent and recent agreement between the Australian and the Indian heads, and the joint and the strategic partnership that has come about, on the backing of that, operation of the P-8Is from the Australian soil cannot be ruled out where there is a common objective. And this will ensure optimization of resources and will go a long way in surveillance of the straits of Malacca, Lombok, Mumbai, etc., which is enshrined in the Navy's maritime policy of perspective plans. And therefore, one should not get worried that, you know, why are our ships going there and doing this in a mission-based thing? And they will get tired, and, you know, when the actual thing happens, then there won't be any juice left. That is not correct. That's the way the navies operate. That's how we are supposed to be. We are supposed to be out at sea, and some will be at sea, some will be in harbor, and that's how it is. So we should not feel, you know, very little about our own capabilities as far as our ships and submarines are concerned. Now let's talk a little bit about the Chinese submarines. Madam Irina just mentioned they have 60 submarines. India has 16 submarines. Well, I'm a submariner, and I had been wearing this badge for the last 40 years. And let me tell you something. Bulk of the Chinese conventional submarines will remain in the South China Sea. The reason is only if they have to traverse all the way and come to the Indian Ocean through the straits which are existent between Indonesia and the Indian Ocean, then they lose their element of surprise. Then it is no longer a submarine. It ends there. But if they have to come all the way around, circumvent these straits and come, then they will not have any endurance left for their deployment. But the same thing doesn't hold good for the nuclear submarines, because they can come from the other side of the world through the Pacific and Atlantic and eventually come and, you know, park in Djibouti, freshen up, and so on and so forth. So the point that I'm trying to say is that by exerting our influence in the Andaman Sea and southwards with the help of our Quad partners, etc., and like-minded navies, intelligence sharing, you know, MDA, so on and so forth, we are going to be able to frustrate China's activities, show them how vulnerable their trade and surface operations are going to be in Indian Ocean in the age of satellites and, you know, with good surveillance maritime aircraft. So this is the point to be driven home. And you're not going to drive this point home if you sit in harbor. That is the point that I'm trying to say. So I also do not agree that we are weak in the land boundaries. We are not. Because the land boundaries, the ratio that is required to achieve the kind of superiority that one needs to come across is almost, in the mountain regions, is almost 1:8. And India enjoys a phenomenal advantage as far as the Air Force is concerned, not because of number of aircrafts or whatever. I mean, I'm digressing a little bit just to draw your attention, is that by sitting quietly at home, okay, you're not going to achieve anything, okay, and you're not going to try and, I mean, contain, if you please, use the word contain China, or make it aware, reiterate that everything is not going to be hunky-dory if you try any stunts in the Indian Ocean. So that is the point I'm trying to make, because there are distinct advantages which our Air Force has got, and I'm not going to talk about them now. And I'm sure concerned people, Commodore Vasan, who's an aviator, knows how heights of you know, your airfields and so on and so forth, how they matter. How dispersed runways and at different locations help. So there are different issues. So it's not going to be a cakewalk for anybody, even in the land borders of India. And make no mistake, let not any scholar give you anything, because we are people on the field, we know what it is. So now, I think, so I talked about the surface, the vulnerability of the surface action groups and the vulnerability of the Chinese trade, if they choose to be, belligerent. If they are not belligerent, we have nothing to do. We just do our job, we train ourselves, but we train ourselves in the same areas where we are going to fight. And that is the reason why you go there. But you cannot achieve the same thing by sitting in harbor and thinking that one day you will have resources and build capability, etc., etc. So that is a little different approach that I'm trying to make. And there is no black and white. There are many shades of gray in naval operations, and that is what is going to happen. So while China is worried about its strategic depth of the east coast of China, because that is where their economy is that one slice along the coast, which is so vulnerable. And to achieve strategic depth of that east coast, it is actually building these islands, etc., so that it has depth. And whatever you may call it, cartographic invasion and bullying and whatever. But that's the main idea. But if they come into a conflict at sea or in land with India, then they cannot achieve their 2049 aim of being getting the top slot. Because if they do so, India will go back 10 years, but they will go back 5 years, and they don't want it. So let that be a very clear, I think that's a very clear line, that China cannot afford to go back 5 years, because that 5 years can thereafter become 10 years. And as far as India-China gap, even in maritime context is concerned, the lines of logistics for China is going to be so long, it is going to be rather difficult. So good luck to China. They have to wait till the North Sea becomes totally functional, the North Sea route, and maybe things will change. So thank you very much. I'm willing to take questions, but I'll end my talk now.
Thank you, Admiral Chatterjee. I think before I open the discussion or Q&A session, I'll ask a small question to Admiral Chatterjee. You mentioned about the economic potentialities of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Recently, Indonesia has shown a lot of interest to develop closer interaction between Aceh and Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and which is only just about 80 nautical miles. And there are immense possibilities, I think, in terms of building it up as a kind of a economic sort of zone, a special economic zone, and a lot of other tourist and various other activities. Can you just comment a little bit on that?
Well, I have been to that place, city, and so there are efforts to forge some relationships, and as you know that we are doing some work in Sabang, etc. So Indonesia is a very important country to us, and we would treasure their friendship, and we like to cooperate with them as much as we can.
Okay, thank you. I think now it's open to questions. Some of the questions are already answered through the chats, I've noticed. Now, if there are some more, please put your question, brief, and also mention the persons to whom it is directed. Thank you. No question?
Excuse me, Professor Chatterjee, I think, Professor Ghoshal, I think if we do it like that, I think it would become
Okay.
But let's just request people to put their comments on the chat section. Meanwhile, I think Ambassador Gaurishankar Gupta is here. He is a distinguished advisor of the Tillotoma Foundation. So if he wants to make some comments, he can make.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me this chance to speak a few words on this. Firstly, I would like to congratulate all the speakers. I missed the first two speakers, but I heard the remaining four. I must congratulate them for putting a very, I would say, learned expose on this issue. What I would like to say, it is true that China is projecting itself that it is primarily concerned with the economic issues and the trade routes through the Indian Ocean, and that is why it is trying to, increase its power in the Indian Ocean. But I don't believe so. It is not entirely true, because they have done things which are more of a strategic interest rather than simply the commercial interest. What they did in Maldives, what they did in Sri Lanka, what they are doing, trying to do in Myanmar, and they are looking for something in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Iran. I think this is all linked to a strategic reach of China into the entire Indian Ocean region, particularly to put India in a very difficult situation. So I do not believe that it is only for the commercial concerns, only for economic interest, but I firmly believe that it is a strategic policy of China to encircle India through what we call the pearls in the necklace. And these are many pearls in the necklace. And I think India has to be very careful on this. And this strategy of aligning with other countries with the similar kind of concerns in the region is an important strategy. It's not only the Quad, I think it can be Quad plus other countries who are interested in containing the aggressive nature of Chinese strategy in the region. That is one, and that aggressiveness has been shown by China, not only here, but also in South China Sea. It has been shown recently on the Indo-China border. They have done it with Vietnam, they have done it with Japan, and they are doing even the small level like Bhutan. So I think the aggressive nature of Chinese policy in terms of their military reach is quite visible, and we should not ignore. If we want the democratic countries to survive, if we want the world to have a fair and transparent system, I think those countries should now rise to the occasion, because the China has one-party system. It's completely intransparent. There's no freedom of speech, there's no justice, and it's completely autocratic. So if you want to fight that kind of system in the world, it is time that the countries rise to the occasion, come together and realize the gravity of the things that are likely to come in the future. And that is what happened after US did an opening with China in early 70s, and we can see the results today after 30-40 years. The same thing will happen from today. In about 20 to 30 years, the China would be having a completely different approach to the world on the maritime side. And therefore, if we want to wake up, I think it is a wake-up call for the entire region and all the democratic countries in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think there are some questions. I think one question I can direct to Commander Abhijit Singh. So the question is that the question, whoever is asking the question, he feels that India should jump headlong into Quad, because that would give us a chance to defend ourselves with the Chinese. So he's asking for your opinion on that we should immediately jump into Quad.
I think India will have to align with.
No, the question is actually for
Addressed to
Abhijit Singh.
Abhijit.
Abhijit, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, just a minute. Yeah, done.
Okay, thanks. No, I mean, look, the thing is that the time that I wrote that article, I did receive some pushback from many in the strategic community as well as the naval community to say that this was really a defensive argument that I was making, that we should not try and challenge China. But really, if you read that article, and even if you actually look at what I said, is that this is really a nuanced argument. I'm not trying to say that we should not opt for a military quad. I think the military quad is definitely an option on the table. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you can. So a military quad is definitely an option on the table. And in time, a military quad is going to achieve the required results that we seek from it. My only argument was that we've got to time the military quad well, because look at it like this, that in peacetime, China is quite entitled to use the choke points, the sea lanes, to have presence in South Asia, in Central Asia, in Africa, by forming a military alliance and by trying to stop China from doing what the world considers to be a legitimate activity, for that matter, to be a legitimate ambition. We are going to be projecting ourselves in poor light. So my argument was that let's wait for China to cross our red lines, which means if China gets aggressive with us in the Indian Ocean, which it will, if we continue to apply pressure on China on the border. And again, I'm not making the point that China has overtaken us on the border, or for that matter, China is dominant on the border. All I'm trying to say is that the terrain of Ladakh in those places where the Chinese have managed to nibble some Indian territory favors the Chinese. They're in a position, if you look at what's happening in Depsang, if you look at what's happening in Pangongso Lake, the Chinese are refusing to pull back. And there's nothing that Indian negotiators can do to make them pull back. So there are others that are saying that let's open up the maritime front. And I was arguing to say that this may not be the right time to open the maritime front, because all said and done, we are still negotiating with China. It sends contrary signals to China if you open up the maritime front, and on the other hand, you're negotiating truce with them. Second, in peacetime, when the Chinese are not being aggressive at sea, they're not accosting your warships, they're not challenging you in your territorial seas, they're not stopping your trade, the onus of aggression has shifted onto the Indian Navy. And the Indian Navy, again, I'm not making an argument. I mean, I heard Admiral Chatterjee say that we are not supposed to stay in harbor. I'm not saying we should stay in harbor. But I'm saying that if we are unnecessarily aggressive with China, the impression that is going to go out is that we are escalating at sea, wherein China would stand to sort of gain from this narrative, because this is the real narrative that China wants to construct, that India is the more aggressive power. India is the one that attacked Chinese soldiers on the border, and India is the one that's being aggressive at sea. So all I was arguing is that let's time the quad well, but I'm not making an argument that we should not go in for a military quad, or we should in some ways be quiet, or for that matter, take a back seat in this rivalry with China.
I think Satul Limaye has a question to Admiral Chatterjee and David. What are your respective views of opportunities and constraints for the India-Australia naval relationship? David, just how interested is Australia in the Indian Ocean? Australian analysts and others give mixed signals of the importance compared to Pacific Islands region and Southeast Asia. Now, David or Admiral Chatterjee have
I think Dr. Brewster is not here in the meeting.
Yes, left. Then in that case, maybe Admiral Chatterjee might be able to give answer to this Satul's question.
Audible?
Yeah.
Right. Right. So, you know, over the past 8 or 9 years, we've been having cordial Navy-to-Navy relations, as all navies do, ship visits and port visits and so on and so forth. But I think there has been some change in the last 2 to 3 years. If you even go through the frequency of visits, etc., bilateral talks, etc. So, to answer your question, that the Indian Navy, I mean, I'm not speaking as a naval spokesman, but I'm just speaking as a veteran. And if I would be the one to give a suggestion to the decision maker, I would say that there is no constraints. We are so geographically distant from each other, and we just do not pose any kind of natural threat to each other. There is only a huge, long room for cooperation, and both Australia and India would gain immensely if we get into a solid cooperation, which should be well documented and should be objective.
Okay, then any other question?
I think, Professor Ghoshal, there was a question on Quad Plus. I think we can take
Okay.
Admiral Jainath's views on that, since Dr. Dick Brewster is not here. I'm unmuting you. Give me a minute.
Yeah.
Well, as a small but strategically important located country, we look at Quad or the Quad Plus, or I think India like to call it always IQUAD, that is inclusive Quad. I mean, in a very different way from the Quad players, because the Quad players, I mean, we heard the 4 pillars of Quad, or when you say Quad Plus, whether it is England and France, or the European Union interest in Quad. I think many countries other than the pillars of Quad look at Quad with, what is going to be Quad, whether it is going to be a military alliance. And I believe, from what I see from Sri Lanka, there is a maritime cool war taking place in the Indian Ocean. I mean, I will substantiate my argument. It's not exactly a cold war, but a military, a maritime cool war. So our worry is, will Quad or Quad Plus will aggravate this maritime cool war into a maritime cold war, and subsequently to a arms race in the Indian Ocean. I mean, I would also argue that right now, the Indian Ocean is the most militarized ocean in the world. I think at any given time, we have about 120 warships belonging to about 28 to 30 different nations present in the Indian Ocean. I mean, we all know that there was an open invitation for world navies to come into the Indian Ocean, and they came in like 28, 29, but they're still here, right? So we look at Quad with a very apprehension whether it would lead to a maritime cold war, and we are very concerned about it, because I think the Indian Ocean is already militarized, and I don't think as a small country, we would like to see the Indian Ocean getting more militarized. So that's, I mean, Quad, will it give rise to a maritime cold war is the concern of many countries outside the pillar countries.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Anyone else?
I think, Professor Ghoshal, there is another question along with that question which was asked to Dr. Brewster, that the role of Russia in containing China's belligerency. So if any of the speakers want to take on this. Perhaps Dr. Pop, maybe?
Please repeat the question.
The role of Russia in containing, in any framework or any Quad Plus setup, to contain China's belligerence.
Yes, For the moment, the two countries are partners, strategic partners, but even before 2000, excuse me for a moment, even before 2000, there were some Russian experts who talk about this migration represents for Russia in the long term. And I don't know if you hear me right. Usually, for example, in Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they tend to have divergent positions towards some members, including when, for example, it was the Georgian War, when Russia invaded Georgia in South Caucasus, China did not support Russia in a very open way at that time. So I think they are partners on short and medium term regarding the West. But in the longer term, there would be some frictions in the common neighborhood, Central Asia, Siberia, Russian Far East. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we can, because Dr. Limaya, you have written in the comment section, maybe you can elaborate on that. Okay, I'm unmuting.
Sorry, the question to me was what? I'm sorry, I did not get that question.
You know, the answer that you wrote in the comment section, if you can elaborate on that.
Oh, I posed a question to Admiral from Sri Lanka about Japanese maritime self-defense forces. Last time I counted them, and my count may be a little bit off, but there were over 90 some Japanese MSDF visits, mostly in transit to Djibouti and via their activities for as independent deployers for CTF 151. And I just wondered if Japan has expressed any interest in regular facilities, pre-positioning, regular exercise in Sri Lanka, and whether the government of Sri Lanka would be receptive to such a request from Japan. Thank you so much, Admiral, for your comments and for considering the question.
I think Pradeep Koshiba, Admiral Koshiba, wanted to make a comment on the Quad. So, yeah, please. Pradeep Koshiba.
Thank you, Chair. Could we wait for whatever Satu Leme had asked? That could be answered, then I can come along.
He has already, I think.
I already did online.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see it online. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so my brief comment on the Quad was most certainly, if the Quad is looked at as originally was being seen and made out by China, that this is a military equivalent to a military alliance or a maritime NATO, then by all means, all varieties of comments would come up, most of them in the negative manner for reception, and particularly those smaller countries, as rightly mentioned by Admiral Columbage, that they have far more to lose by joining up than they have gain of by staying out. So that is different. My posture on Quad was something slightly different, and that is that in this region, we do not have any history, background, or narrative of a regional framework for cooperation. Now, let me make a clear distinction. A military alliance, like say NATO or any other, there the forces or the countries act in concert. If we see Quad plus, Quad, or what I'm calling the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Framework, so TIP MSF, if we see that not acting in concert, but acting in coordination and collaboration, that means each contributory nation's maritime forces continue to do what they are doing in their own waters, in their vicinity, in coordination with others adjoining members. There will be a lot of mutual support, and there'll be much less reason for friction, much less opportunities for friction. And India is one of those examples in that we have been excising, having bilateral excises with a lot of our maritime neighbors. This is the kind of thing, this was the meaning of what I was suggesting, that Quad Plus or iQuad or TIP MSF or whatever we are going to call it, could be actually a series of bilaterals or small multilaterals. These are not focused against anybody. These are in fact focused for something, and that is being collaborative, cooperative, mutually supportive. That was the concept. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions? I think we have another 5 minutes. If anybody feels stuck.
We can take a comment from Mr. Neo from Myanmar, since there were some questions to him which he briefly discussed in the comment section.
Yeah, right. Professor Neo.
Yes.
There were some questions to you on the comment section which you answered briefly. If you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, I aware that India is trying to help Myanmar and doing some of the investment in infrastructure. Yeah, we welcome that, but until now, India is lagging behind China. That is fine. As I mentioned earlier, we need more. We need to diversify our dependence on China, but until now, not yet.
How do you look at the BIMSTEC?
I think it is out of my sight. I'm not aware much about BIMSTEC. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other question? If not, then you have to.
Yeah.
I think I'll try to summarize it.
Sure.
My father used to tell me that if you cannot summarize your views in 3 sentences, you have no views. So I think I'll use only 3 sentences to summarize the entire thing. The first sentence is related to my hypothesis about bellicosity. That has already been negated by Satu Limaye, and to a certain extent other participants also. The second sentence is some kind of a consensus that China is willing to, or China is determined to have influence in the Indian Ocean. I think there is no doubt about that, and everybody agrees. I think all the participants did so. But the differences arose when it comes to implications. Different countries view the implications differently. As far as India is concerned, India has rather unpleasant experiences with China, and that's why India is much more suspicious about China's motives. And from the experiences in Ladakh and various other places, India obviously is much more skeptical about China's peaceful intentions. Whereas the smaller countries obviously need investments, support for infrastructures, funding for which they cannot afford, and obviously they would like to welcome the Chinese investment, despite the fact that they also have certain reservations about China's influence in a very direct way. I think that sums up the essence of this discussion. And with that, I think I should thank all the panelists and the participants who joined this webinar to make it a successful venture. Thank you. Good evening. I don't say these days good evening or good morning. With the kind of lockdown, I say good eternity. Because it is eternal. Wish for a good evening or a good morning. You never know when the scout is going to attack either you or your nearby